A suitcase started barking. That's how it all began. 6:45 a.m. at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, where 59-year-old retired Army medic James Callahan was on patrol with his K-9 partner, Scout. The terminal buzzed with the usual shuffle of travelers, but Scout stopped cold near an old, forgotten suitcase by a broken baggage carousel, and growled. James expected a false alarm, until the zipper moved. What they found wasn't a threat, but it shook him to his core. A tiny girl no older than 4, curled inside, clinging to a ragged teddy bear. And in that instant, James felt something stir, something he thought he'd buried long ago. Who was this little girl, and how did she end up there? Don't miss the rest of this unbelievable story. Subscribe now so you won't miss what happens next in our rescue series. James stood frozen. The girl inside the suitcase didn't cry, didn't scream. She just stared up at him with wide, hollow eyes that held more silence than any child should ever know. Her skin was cold to the touch, her tiny frame barely covered in a stained t-shirt and mismatched socks. And there, clutched tightly against her chest, was a threadbare teddy bear, its button eyes scratched and faded. James's heart clenched. It wasn't just the shock of what he'd found. It was the memory it unearthed. His own daughter, Emily, would have been about her age now, if she had lived. For the first time in years, James felt his voice catch. Scout, sensing the shift in his partner, sat silently beside him, ears back, eyes fixed on the trembling child. Emergency medics arrived, but she wouldn't let go of the bear. She wouldn't speak. She wouldn't look away from James. There was something in that look, something pleading. Later, as the crowd dispersed and news crews hovered just outside the terminal, James lingered by the medical station. The girl, now wrapped in a soft blanket, rested on a cot under fluorescent lights, her eyes fluttering but never quite closing. The authorities had no name for her, no ID, no missing person report, nothing. To the world she was a mystery. But to James, she was a heartbeat he hadn't known he was missing. They called her Jane Doe. No last name, no history, just a file number and a fragile presence curled beneath a hospital blanket. But for James Callahan, that wasn't enough. That little girl had trusted him when she couldn't speak, when her world had collapsed into the cold confines of a suitcase. And that meant something. The FBI was investigating. The local news had already dubbed it the airport mystery, and social workers were lining up to take temporary custody. But every time one of them stepped close, the girl would recoil, eyes darting, until they landed on James. With him, she breathed differently. Her body softened. She let the bear go. The airport security chief called it an anomaly. James didn't care. When the child welfare representative asked if he'd consider temporary guardianship, he didn't hesitate. "She doesn't need a stranger," he said softly. "She needs someone she already trusts." That night, his quiet 2-bedroom apartment in Marietta, Georgia, changed forever. He cleared out the dusty guest room, borrowed a toddler mattress from a neighbor, and placed Scout's old stuffed animals along the edges like sentries. He even left the nightlight on, something he hadn't done since Emily was alive. James didn't know what tomorrow would bring. The investigation was still young, and answers were painfully scarce. But when he peeked in and saw her asleep, her tiny hand resting on Scout's paw, he understood one thing deeply. She didn't just need protection, she needed someone to stay. It started with silence, long stretches of it. No giggles, no cries, not even a good morning. James didn't push. He knew trauma didn't unravel on command. Instead, he created rhythm. Mornings meant scrambled eggs and applesauce. Afternoons were quiet walks with Scout through the neighborhood. Evenings, a bedtime story, though she never asked for one. He called her Grace because something about her reminded him of it. Fragile, resilient, undeserved. At first, she barely responded. She'd clutch that bear like it was the only thing holding her together. But James noticed the small shifts. A glance toward him during dinner. The way her body leaned slightly closer when Scout rested his head in her lap. Then one night, standing at the doorway with her bear in her arms, she spoke, barely above a whisper. I had a house, big, with a lot of people. James's breath caught. She didn't look at him. Her eyes stayed on the floor, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to speak. He crouched to her level, heart pounding. A big house? He asked gently. She nodded, then retreated into silence. But that one thread, thin as it was, gave James hope. Memories were surfacing, clues that might lead them somewhere. Still, he knew not to rush it, because sometimes the road back to trust isn't a sprint. It's a quiet walk in borrowed shoes, one painful step at a time. James began piecing together her fragments like a jigsaw puzzle without a picture on the box. Grace never spoke in full sentences, just scattered memories, like leaves drifting on wind. A cold floor, a long hallway, a woman who didn't like me to talk. James would jot everything down in a worn leather notebook, the same one he used during his deployments. But this wasn't combat. It was heartbreak in slow motion. One rainy Tuesday, she pointed at the TV during a local news segment about historic homes in Georgia. That, she whispered. It looked like that. Her voice trembled, but James didn't miss a beat. He paused the screen and took a photo of the house. Then he started digging. He spent nights combing through public records, zoning documents, even old community forums. Most led to dead ends, but one lead, a whispered rumor from a shelter volunteer, spoke of a secluded estate on the outskirts of Cherokee County. Locals called it the Pines. Said it was run by a woman with money and connections, and that strange things happened behind its iron gates. James drove out there at dusk. The place stood like a fortress. High walls, security cameras, silence. It didn't feel abandoned, but it didn't feel alive either. Something about it stirred his instincts, the same gut feeling he used to trust overseas. Back home, Grace was asleep. He stood by her door, hand on the knob, mind racing. He didn't know what exactly happened inside that mansion, but he was certain of one thing. It had taken something from her, and he was going to get it back. If you're holding your breath like we are, don't blink now. Subscribe and follow us as we uncover the haunting truth behind those guarded walls. Back at home, James tried to keep things normal, for Grace's sake and his own. Breakfast, walks with Scout, picture books before bed. But underneath it all, something had shifted. He wasn't just looking after her anymore. He was fighting for her. Grace began to change too. Small things. She no longer flinched when the doorbell rang. She started humming to herself while coloring. And one night, as James tucked her in, she reached for his hand and held it tightly. "Will you stay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't just a child's bedtime question, it was a plea, one forged from fear, loss, and a flicker of hope. "I'll stay," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "I promise." And in that moment the room was quiet, but not empty. It was full of something new, something that had been missing from James's life for far too long. Purpose. He realized he wasn't just rescuing her. She was rescuing him, too. The case was still unresolved. The mansion still loomed in his thoughts like a ghost he hadn't confronted. But for now she was safe. She was warm. And for the first time since that morning at the airport, her breathing was steady. She didn't need a savior, she needed a constant. And that's exactly who he intended to be. Back at home, James tried to keep things normal, for Grace's sake and his own. Breakfast, walks with Scout, picture books before bed. But underneath it all, something had shifted. He wasn't just looking after her anymore. He was fighting for her. Grace began to change too. Small things. She no longer flinched when the doorbell rang. She started humming to herself while coloring. And one night, as James tucked her in, she reached for his hand and held it tightly. "Will you stay?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James felt the air leave his lungs. It wasn't just a child's bedtime question, it was a plea, one forged from fear, loss, and a flicker of hope. "I'll stay," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "I promise." And in that moment the room was quiet, but not empty. It was full of something new, something that had been missing from James's life for far too long. Purpose. He realized he wasn't just rescuing her. She was rescuing him, too. The case was still unresolved. The mansion still loomed in his thoughts like a ghost he hadn't confronted. But for now she was safe. She was warm. And for the first time since that morning at the airport, her breathing was steady. She didn't need a savior, she needed a constant. And that's exactly who he intended to be. This story reminds us that healing often begins with presence, not answers. In a world that moves quickly and values productivity, we sometimes forget the quiet power of simply showing up for someone in pain. James didn't rescue Grace with grand gestures, but with patience, consistency, and compassion. For older adults who've lived through losses and life storms, it's a tender reminder that purpose can return in unexpected ways. Sometimes the most profound impact we can have is not in fixing someone's past, but in becoming a safe place for their future. Love, after all, is a choice we make daily.